Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 8 of our course. Over the next few weeks, we are really going to be focusing on measuring the growth and output of a macro economy. And as you're reading through these theories and concepts and different variables that we'll be learning about in the coming weeks, I want to remind you to take the time to look up these variables and concepts for your particular country for your final project. As we read through the material in the coming weeks, we'll be learning how to answer the following questions. How do we measure the health of an economy? What is our relative size or growth compared to other economies? Are we progressing or are we regressing as an economy? And where may we have room for improvement? There is a lot of different ways to look at the growth and the progress of a particular economy, and I don't want you to get caught up in one variable. As we learn about different variables, I want you to look at each different concept as a different tool in a toolkit to compare the growth and the progress of economy against another one. The main tool that we hear about most in the news and the concept that we'll be learning about this week is GDP and GDI, which stand for Gross Domestic Product and Gross Domestic Income. Let's start off by talking about GDP. The text is going to define GDP as the sum of all of the market value of all goods and services that go within our nation's borders. GDP is often broken down by an equation that is C plus I plus G plus X. So let's break down each one of these variables and discuss what it means and how it applies to GDP. First, C. C stands for our consumption goods. And these consumption goods that happen within the borders of our economy are only our final goods and not our intermediary goods. You can think of a final good as something within the economy that we consume that will not be made into another product. So when we're talking about C, our consumption good, we are only talking about the final good and not necessarily the wood and the cement and the wires that go into making that house. The next element is I, which are our investment expenditures. Investment expenditures can be thought of as the equipment, real estates, and loan payments that happen within our economy. Next is the G, which are our government expenditures, or those expenditures that the government uses to invest within our nation's borders. And finally, X. And X, over the last few years, historically, has been a negative number. It represents our exports, or those final goods that we export out of our country, minus the imports. So the reason it's negative is typically within a developed economy, we import more than we export. The next variable that the text is going to go over is this idea of GDI, or the income approach of measuring the progress of our economy. GDI is going to include all of the wages, interest, rent, and profit within our economy. And in theory, GDP should always equal GDI. In practice, this might not always be the case. And the reason for that is the Bureau of Economic Activity, that calculates these figures, gets those data sources of GDP and GDI from different places, so they don't always equal up in reality. But in theory, GDP and GDI should always equal each other. So, where is the text going to trick you? It's going to trick you in calculating GDP or GDI by including elements that are not included within these figures. It's going to include things like securities, government transfer payments, private transfer payments, the sale of secondhand goods, and underground or black market activity. All of these activities are not included in the calculation of GDP or GDI. So if I were you, I'd always have a handy note card with those different elements that are not included in the calculation. Where does GDP and GDI fall short? Well, there's a few things. It ignores population growth. So our economy might look like it's increasing in value over time, but if population growth is actually going at a higher rate than that GDP growth, then in reality, individuals like you and I are worse off. The measure that takes care of this is per capita growth. So whenever we see per capita growth, we are looking at individual wages or individual breaking up the GDP by individuals. The next thing it ignores is it ignores inflation. And there is a variable that accounts for this, and this is real GDP. The calculation for real GDP is exactly the same as GDP, C plus I plus G plus X. The difference is it minuses depreciation. And when we're comparing one country to another, that inflation or depreciation that we want to be looking at is one country's currency against the others. And that will give you a more realistic look at the growth between the two. Some other things that it ignores is perhaps the variation of prices of final goods and services within particular areas of our economy. Remember, GDP is a macroeconomic measure. So it looks at an economy as a whole. So for example, in Utah, it would look at our rent prices as a whole, our food prices as a whole. However, as you and I know, rent prices, even from Salt Lake City to West Jordan, will vary. And from Salt Lake City to Park City, it will vary. So GDP is going to look at a macroeconomy measure. It's not going to account for the differences within the microeconomy. A good variable to look at if you're interested in that is Glass-Meyer's living wage. Glass-Meyer at Harvard looked at the differences within an economy, and you can look at that living wage and how it varies from one small microeconomy to another. Finally, GDP does not really account for income inequality within an economy. So we might see a lot of growth in total for the economy, but we might be seeing the bottom 50% of our economy and the top 50% grow more and more within a gap. So there's a portion of the population that's better off because GDP is going up, but there may be another portion that is worse off even though GDP is increasing. There is a variable that you can look up to account for these differences as well. The most common one is the Gini index, which specifically looks at income inequality, and if that is improving over time, where you'll see the Gini index start going convex, or if it's going down over time, and you'll see that Gini index be more concave. So that is the main variable and measure of the progress of an economy. If you need any assistance as you go through Chapter 8's homework, let me know. I'd be happy to work through a problem or two. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week. Thanks.